For centuries, the British Isles have been a fortress, seemingly impenetrable. But in 1759, a storm was brewing across the Channel, not of weather, but of 50,000 French soldiers ready to launch a full-scale invasion of Britain, threatening London itself. This is the untold story of the near catastrophe, a desperate scramble by the Royal Navy and the maritime escape that preserved sovereignty by the slimmest of margins. History remembers 1759 as Britain's annus mirabilis, the miraculous year of victories that cemented its global empire. Yet, beneath the surface of these distant triumphs in Quebec and Minden lay a paralysed home front gripped by existential dread. The global theatre of the 7 Years' War had acted as a massive drain on British manpower. The very successes that Parliament celebrated meant that the cream of the British Army was scattered across the globe, fighting in the forests of North America and the heat of India. The British Isles themselves were left dangerously exposed, defended only by skeleton crews of regular troops and untested militias. It was a vulnerability that did not go unnoticed in Versailles. France was losing the colonial war badly. Their navy was stretched, their coffers emptying, and their overseas possessions falling one by one to British aggression. But the French Foreign Minister, the Duc de Choiseul, devised an audacious solution. He recognized that the path to ultimate victory did not lie in defending Canada, but in striking directly at the head of the British snake, London itself. Choiseul's grand strategy, dubbed the Great Enterprise, was built on the belief that Britain was a house of cards. Despite its outward projection of power, he calculated that the island nation was financially overstretched and politically unstable. A successful landing of a significant French force on English soil would not even need to achieve total military conquest. The mere presence of a French army marching towards the capital would be enough to trigger a catastrophic run on the Bank of England. Choiseul gambled that a collapse of public credit would force the British government to its knees, leading to a forced peace treaty that would restore France's lost colonies and shatter British maritime dominance in a single decisive blow. The threat was far from theoretical. Across the Channel, the machinery of invasion began to turn with terrifying industrial scale. The sheer magnitude of the operation was designed to overwhelm any localized resistance the British militia might offer. Choiseul had earmarked approximately 50,000 troops for the assault. These were not the dregs of the army or raw conscripts, but the elite regiments of France, battle-hardened grenadiers and line infantry who had been drilling specifically for this moment. This was to be a knockout blow, delivered by the finest steel in the French arsenal. To transport such a massive host across the unpredictable waters of the English Channel, the French Admiralty initiated a massive construction project that spanned the entire northern coast. In the shipyards of Le Havre, Dunkirk, Brest and Rochefort, the air was filled with the ceaseless ringing of hammers and saws. They were building a purpose-made invasion fleet, hundreds of flat-bottomed boats known as bateaux plats. Unlike traditional deep-draft transports that required deep-water harbours to offload their cargo, these vessels were designed with a singular tactical purpose. They could slide right up onto the shallow, sandy beaches of the English coast, bypassing the heavily fortified major ports where the Royal Navy would expect an attack. They were the landing craft of the 18th century, designed to vomit thousands of soldiers onto English soil in a matter of hours. The assembly point for this grand armada was the Gulf of Morbihan in Brittany. It was a masterstroke of logistical planning. The Gulf was a vast, sheltered inland sea, protected from the Atlantic swells and difficult for British raiding parties to penetrate. Here, safely tucked away under the noses of the British blockades, the transport fleet could gather, drill, and prepare for the crossing. However, the boats were defenceless on the open ocean. They were sitting ducks for any British frigate that might spot them. For the great enterprise to succeed, the French needed to control the Channel if only for a few days. This requirement birthed a complex naval strategy involving a pincer movement of imperial proportions. The plan called for the union of France's two great naval forces. The Mediterranean fleet, commanded by Admiral Delaclue, was ordered to break out of Toulon, sail past Gibraltar, and race north to join forces with the Atlantic fleet stationed at Brest, under the command of the Comte de Conflans. Combined, this superfleet would possess the firepower to sweep the Royal Navy from the seas, creating a corridor of safety for the troop transports to make their dash. But Choiseul knew that brute force might not be enough against the seasoned captains of the Royal Navy. He needed deception. A plan was hatched to fracture the British defences through misdirection. A smaller, agile force under the command of the famous privateer-turned-commander, François Thiroux, was assembled at Dunkirk. Thiroux's mission was to slip out and strike at Ireland or Scotland, specifically targeting Carrickfergus. The goal was not conquest but chaos, to incite a Jacobite uprising or an Irish rebellion, forcing the British Admiralty to panic and send precious ships north, leaving the southern coast exposed. While British eyes were turned north, the main hammer blow would fall on the soft underbelly of England. The primary invasion army, commanded by the Duc d'Aiguillon, was not aiming for the White Cliffs of Dover, which were obvious and defensible. Instead, they targeted the flat, marshy coast of Essex, specifically near Maldon. The strategic genius of this choice lay in the geography. Landing in Essex meant the French army would be north of the River Thames. They would not have to cross the formidable barrier of the river to reach the capital. From Maldon, it was a straight, terrifyingly short march over flat ground directly into the unfortified streets of London. The plan was meticulous. The resources were allocated and the troops were ready. All France needed now was the weather to cooperate. Across the Channel, the British government was slowly waking up to the nightmare unfolding on its doorstep. Intelligence gathering in the 18th century was a slow, murky business, relying on networks of paid informants and loose-lipped sailors in tavern ports. At first, reports of the flat-bottomed boats were dismissed by some in the Admiralty as exaggerated rumours or preparations for minor coastal raids. But as the volume of construction reports grew undeniable, the pieces of the puzzle began to lock into a terrifying picture. This was no raid, it was an annihilation force. Panic began to ripple through the streets of London. The confident swagger of an empire winning battles abroad evaporated, replaced by the cold reality of a defenceless home. The government had passed the Militia Act of 1757 to raise a home defence force, and by 1759, these units were finally being mustered. But as these men drilled on village greens, the disparity was painfully obvious. These were farmers and shopkeepers, armed with muskets they barely knew how to load, preparing to face the professional grenadiers of France. Field Marshal Lord Ligonier, the commander-in-chief of the forces, began hastily drawing up defensive lines around London, but privately, the military leadership knew the grim truth. If the French army landed intact, the few thousand regular troops available would be swept aside. The militia would be little more than a speed bump on the road to the capital. The survival of the nation rested entirely on the wooden walls, the ships of the Royal Navy. The Admiralty knew they could not win a land war in Essex. They had to win the war at sea before a single French boot touched English sand. To achieve this, Admiral Edward Hawke implemented a strategy of punishing endurance known as the close blockade. Hawke refused to keep his fleet safe in Portsmouth or Plymouth. Instead, he deployed his Western Squadron to patrol directly off the French coast of Brest, locking Admiral Conflans and the French Atlantic Fleet inside their own harbour. It was a logistical and human nightmare. For months on end, British crews endured the battering of Atlantic storms, battling scurvy, rotting food, and exhaustion to maintain an iron grip on the enemy port. They rotated ships back to England only for essential repairs, creating a relentless, unbreakable chain of surveillance. While Hawke strangled the French at Brest, the southern arm of the French pincer movement was already in motion. Admiral de la Clue slipped out of Toulon with the Mediterranean fleet, aiming to bypass Gibraltar and race north. But the Royal Navy was waiting. Admiral Edward Boscawen intercepted the French squadron off the coast of Portugal in August. At the Battle of Lagos, Boscawen shattered the Mediterranean fleet, capturing or destroying key ships and scattering the rest. When news of Lagos reached London, there was a collective sigh of relief. One half of the French plan had been neutralized. But the danger was far from over. The great enterprise was wounded, not dead. The massive invasion army was still waiting in Brittany, and the powerful French Atlantic fleet under Conflans sat untouched in Brest, watching, waiting for the British to make a mistake. The French did not need to defeat the Royal Navy in a fair fight. They just needed a window of opportunity. They needed the weather to turn against the British, to blow Hawke's blockading ships off their station, and leave the door to the English Channel wide open. In November 1759, the French prayers were finally answered. A ferocious winter gale, the kind that shreds sails and snaps masts, roared through the Atlantic. The violence of the storm was too much, even for the hardened crews of the Western Squadron. To save his ships from being wrecked against the rocky coast they were blockading, Admiral Hawke was forced to lift the siege. He signalled the retreat, and the British fleet was blown back across the Channel to the shelter of Torbay on the English coast. For Admiral Conflans, peering out from the safety of Brest, the empty horizon was the signal he had been waiting for. The British jailers were gone. On November 14th, seizing the brief window of opportunity, the French fleet slipped its moorings. 21 ships of the line, magnificent three-decked war machines, surged out into the Atlantic. Their destination was not England, not yet. They turned southeast, racing towards the Gulf of Morbihan to rendezvous with the transport fleet and the waiting invasion army. But the ocean is a fickle mistress. Just as Conflans made his move, the winds shifted. Back in Torbay, Hawke did not rest. The moment the gale subsided slightly, he ordered his fleet back to sea. He knew that if Conflans had escaped, the safety of England hung by a thread. The British ships piled on every inch of canvas they dared, straining the rigging to the breaking point, tearing back towards the French coast with a desperation fueled by the knowledge of what lay at stake. On the morning of November 20th, the two fleets sighted each other. Conflans was stunned. He had expected the British to be miles away, refitting in port. Instead, he saw the white sails of Hawke's squadron cresting the horizon, bearing down on him like a pack of wolves. Realizing he could not protect the slow-moving transports in a running battle, and unwilling to fight the British in open water, where their gunnery was superior, Conflans made a fateful decision. He ordered his fleet to run for safety. He steered his ships toward Quiberon Bay. To the uninitiated, it looked like a sanctuary. But to any sailor worth his salt, Quiberon Bay was a death trap. It was a labyrinth of hidden shoals, jagged rocks, and treacherous currents, unmapped and lethal to large warships. Conflans believed that no British admiral, no matter how aggressive, would be insane enough to follow him into such a navigational graveyard, especially not with a gale rising and night falling. He planned to anchor safely inside the bay, protected by the rocks and shore batteries, and laugh as the British were forced to turn away. It was a sound calculation against a rational opponent. But Edward Hawke was not in a rational mood. As the Royal George, Hawke's massive flagship, approached the foaming entrance of the bay, the ship's master, the officer responsible for navigation, remonstrated with the admiral. He laid out the charts, pointing to the shoals and the reefs, warning that entering the bay without a pilot in a storm would almost certainly lead to the wreck of the fleet. Hawke's reply would echo through naval history. He listened to the warning, acknowledged the danger, and then coolly replied, "You have done your duty, sir. Now lay me alongside the French admiral." Hawke ignored the rules of war and the laws of survival. He ordered the signal for General Chase to be hoisted. The British fleet did not form a line of battle. They simply unleashed their ships, each captain ordered to hunt down a French vessel and destroy it. They charged straight into the teeth of the gale, surfing down the massive Atlantic rollers, plunging headlong into the rocky labyrinth of Quiberon Bay. The French, watching the British prow plough through the waves toward them, realized with dawning horror that they were not safe. The enemy was coming in with the storm. What followed was one of the most chaotic and terrifying engagements in naval history. The Battle of Quiberon Bay was not fought with the polite geometry of standard 18th century warfare. There were no neat lines of battle, no courteous exchanges of broadsides. It was a brawl in a hurricane, a knife fight in a dark, flooding room. As the British ships surged into the bay, the wind howled at 40 knots, whipping the sea into a frenzy of 20-foot waves. The noise was apocalyptic. The screaming of the wind in the rigging, the thunder of the surf pounding against the jagged rocks of the Cardinals, and the deafening roar of heavy cannon fire. The conditions were so extreme that the ships were rolling violently, their masts tracing wild arcs across the grey sky. For the gun crews below decks, the battle was a nightmare of physics. To fire the main battery, the massive 32-pounder cannons on the lower deck, the gun ports had to be opened. But with the ships heeling over in the gale, opening a port on the leeward side invited the Atlantic Ocean to pour in. This danger became a horrifying reality for the French ship Thésée. In a desperate attempt to return fire against the British captain Keppel in the Torbay, the French commander ordered his lower ports opened. As the ship rolled, the sea rushed in with unstoppable force. In moments, the Thésée capsized and plunged to the bottom, taking over 600 men straight down into the cold abyss. To the horror of the British sailors watching, there was no time to launch boats. The ship simply vanished, swallowed by the storm. Hawke, aboard the Royal George, remained the eye of the hurricane. He manoeuvred his massive flagship with cool precision, hunting for Conflans' flagship, the Soleil Royal. The French admiral, seeing the British fleet tearing through his formation, found himself trapped. The defensive advantages of the bay had turned against him. The shoals forced the ships into confined spaces, making them easy targets for the pursuing British. The Superbe, another French 74-gun ship, was caught by Hawke's broadside. One moment she was a fighting ship, the next she capsized and sank with a catastrophic suddenness, leaving only oil and wreckage on the foaming surface. As afternoon faded into the premature twilight of a winter storm, the battle descended into pure anarchy. Ships fired at flashes in the gloom, unsure if they were targeting friend or foe. Navigation became a game of Russian roulette. The sound of wood splintering against rock signaled the end for several vessels as the gale drove them mercilessly onto the granite teeth of the coast. The Hérault surrendered, but the sea was too rough for the British to board her, so she dragged her anchors and smashed onto the rocks. When night finally fell, the firing died away, replaced by the sound of distress signals and the crashing of waves. Both fleets dropped anchor where they stood, praying their cables would hold against the fury of the storm. It was a long, terrifying night. Sailors on both sides listened to the sound of breakers nearby, knowing that if their anchor chains snapped, they would be broken against the cliffs before morning. When the pale grey light of dawn finally illuminated the bay on November 21st, the scale of the French disaster was laid bare. The great enterprise lay in ruins. The mighty Soleil Royal, the pride of the French navy and symbol of the king's power, had been run aground by Conflans to prevent her capture. She lay on her side, a broken giant, before being set ablaze by her own crew. Smoke billowed across the water as the charred skeletons of French warships drifted on the tide. But perhaps the most poignant sight was not at sea, but on land. Gathered on the shores of the Gulf of Morbihan, thousands of French soldiers, the army destined for London, stood watching in silence. They had lined the cliffs to cheer their fleet's departure. Instead, they witnessed its annihilation. They saw the burning hulks and the wreckage washing ashore. In that cold morning light, every soldier, from the humblest private to the Duc d'Aiguillon, understood the truth. There would be no crossing. The invasion barges would never leave the harbour. The road to London was closed. The Battle of Quiberon Bay was absolute. 7 major French ships had been taken, sunk, or wrecked. The remainder of the fleet had scattered, fleeing up the shallow estuaries of the Vilaine and Charente rivers, throwing their heavy cannon overboard in a desperate bid to lighten their draft and escape the British wolves. These ships would remain trapped for months, effectively removed from the war. In a single afternoon of violence, the French Navy had ceased to exist as a fighting force, capable of challenging British command of the sea. Back in London, the news of Hawke's victory arrived like a reprieve from a death sentence. The relief was palpable. The bonfires that had been prepared to signal the invasion were instead lit in celebration. The Phantom Armada, which had haunted the nightmares of British citizens for a year, had been exorcised not by luck, but by the relentless aggression of the Royal Navy. The invasion of 1759 is often forgotten today, overshadowed by the famous Spanish Armada of 1588 or the Battle of Britain in 1940. Yet the danger in 1759 was arguably far greater. The Spanish Armada had been a cumbersome, disorganized crusade. The French plan of 1759 was a modern, sophisticated military operation relying on stealth, speed, and a professional army that was arguably the best in Europe. Had they landed, the course of world history would have shifted irrevocably. The ripple effects of Quiberon Bay were profound and immediate. With the French fleet destroyed, the threat to the British Isles vanished. This freed the British government to unleash its full power globally. The ships that had been tied down blockading Brest were now free to escort troop convoys to the far side of the world. In 1760, Britain poured reinforcements into Canada, leading to the final surrender of New France at Montreal. In India, British forces could operate with impunity, cutting off French supplies and securing the subcontinent. The victory at Quiberon Bay was the keystone that held up the arch of the entire British Empire. Without it, the victories at Quebec and Plassey might have been reversed at the peace table by a French army occupying London. It also fundamentally reshaped British naval doctrine. Hawke had proven that the Royal Navy did not need to wait for the enemy to come to them. They could fight the enemy on their own coast, in their own waters, even in the midst of a storm. This philosophy of forward defence became the hallmark of the Royal Navy for the next century and a half. It was the spiritual predecessor to Nelson's tactics at Trafalgar. The belief that the greatest risk was not losing ships, but failing to destroy the enemy. However, the victory came at a cost. The men who had spent months at sea, rotting with scurvy and battered by storms, were not immediately hailed as heroes in the way Wolfe was after Quebec. Hawke himself was criticised by some ungrateful politicians for not capturing every single French ship. But the sailors knew what they had achieved. They had sung a song during the long blockade that captured their cynical reality. Ere Hawke did bang, Monsieur Conflans, you sent us beef and beer. Now Monsieur's beat, we've naught to eat, since you have naught to fear. The British public, safe once more, quickly forgot the terror that had gripped them. The year of victories was celebrated, but the near miss, the moment the knife was at their throat, faded into the background of national memory. For the two men at the centre of the storm, the aftermath of Quiberon Bay offered starkly different fates, mirroring the trajectories of the nations they served. The Comte de Conflans returned to Brest a broken man. He had lost the king's fleet, the trust of the army, and the hope of the nation. In the unforgiving court of Versailles, failure was not tolerated, even when caused by the elements. Conflans was ridiculed, stripping of his prestige, his career ending in the cold shadow of disgrace. He became the scapegoat for the great enterprise, a symbol of French overreach and naval incompetence. Across the Channel, Sir Edward Hawke eventually received the recognition he deserved, though it came slowly from a government that often took its navy for granted. Yet, among his sailors and the people of Britain, he was a titan. He was the man who had chased the French into hell and come back out again. His gamble had paid off, not just in destroyed ships, but in the total psychological dominance of the seas. For the remainder of the war, French squadrons stayed in port, terrified to leave the safety of their harbours. The Royal Navy roamed the oceans as the undisputed masters of the waves, a supremacy that would go virtually unchallenged until the American War of Independence decades later. The army that had gathered in Brittany, those 50,000 men who had dreamed of marching on London, were quietly disbanded or redeployed to the meat grinder of the German front. The flat-bottomed boats, built with such urgency and expense, were left to rot in the mud of French estuaries, silent monuments to an ambition that drowned in the Atlantic. The threat of invasion, which had loomed so large over the British consciousness, evaporated like mist in the morning sun. But the most significant legacy of Quiberon Bay was written on the map of the world. With the French Navy crushed, Britain was able to dictate the terms of the Treaty of Paris in 1763. The treaty was a humiliation for France and a triumph for Britain. France ceded Canada, Grenada, St. Vincent, Dominica, Tobago, and Senegal. They withdrew their troops from the Germanic states and acknowledged British dominance in India. It was the birth of the British Empire as a global superpower, a colossus that spanned every ocean. And it was all made possible because, on a stormy November afternoon, a British admiral refused to turn back. Today, the Battle of Quiberon Bay is rarely spoken of in the same breath as Trafalgar or Waterloo. It has no towering column in central London. Its date is not marked by national holidays. It is a victory that history has curiously chosen to whisper rather than shout. Perhaps this is because it was a battle of prevention, a negative victory. We celebrate what happened, not what didn't happen. We remember the victories in Quebec and India, but we forget that they were only preserved because the Battle of London never took place. The lost Battle of London remains one of the great what-ifs of military history. Had the winds favoured Conflans, had Hawke been a more cautious commander, the flat-bottomed boats could have landed their cargo of grenadiers on the Essex coast. The skeleton defences of Britain would likely have crumbled. The Bank of England might have collapsed, and the history of the world would have been written in French, not English. The British Empire, which defined the 19th century, might have been strangled in its cradle. Instead, the year 1759 stands as a testament to the importance of the sea. It proved that for an island nation, the first line of defence, and the only one that truly matters, is the navy. The wooden walls of England held firm, not just by the strength of oak and iron, but by the iron will of the men who sailed them. As we look back at the rise of the British Empire, we must look past the redcoats marching in distant lands and see the grey, storm-tossed waters of the French coast. It was there, in the howling gale of Quiberon Bay, that the destiny of the world was decided. The invasion was stopped, the Phantom Armada vanished, and the sun rose on a British century. The lost battle was never fought, and in that silence lies the greatest victory of all. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the 18th century and the pivotal year of 1759, please leave a like and let us know in the comments. Do you think the French army could have taken London if they had landed? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss a briefing from the Redcoat era. We'll see you in the next one.